It's hard to imagine, nearly 1 million people killed in just 100 days.
Yeah.
In our lifetime, in 1994. That's the Rwandan genocide.
A staggering number.
It really is.
And I think one of the things that makes it so hard to comprehend is that this wasn't, a war between armies.
Right.
This was neighbor turning on neighbor,
Yeah.
often with unimaginable brutality.
Absolutely. And to really dive deep into this, we have an amazing audio documentary.
Yes.
Featuring historian Dan Snow.
Right.
Interviewing a couple of people.
Yeah.
Dr. Scott Strauss, an expert on African politics and violence.
Yes.
And Beata Uzan, who was a teenager.
Wow.
When she lived through the genocide.
It's going to be really interesting to hear her firsthand account.
Yeah, absolutely.
To really get that personal perspective of this event.
For sure. So let's sort of unpack the background a little bit.
Yeah.
The context leading up to this.
Okay.
Because, the documentary does a great job of explaining that Rwanda wasn't always this place of intense ethnic division.
And Dr. Strauss really emphasizes that point.
Okay.
He talks about how for much of the 20th century, Rwanda was under Belgian colonial rule.
Right.
And while the Hutus were the majority population, the Belgians actually favored the Tutsi minority, placing them in positions of power.
So you've got this minority group that's being given preferential treatment.
Exactly.
By the colonial power.
Yeah.
It seems like that would breed resentment.
Absolutely. And Dr. Strauss even explains that the very concept of Hutu and Tutsi, it wasn't rooted in these distinct tribes.
Oh, really?
They spoke the same language. They shared a lot of cultural practices.
Mm-hmm.
They lived in the same regions.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
So they weren't really that different.
No. And the documentary highlights that the differences were more socioeconomic.
Okay.
The Tutsi historically were associated with cattle herding.
Okay.
Hutu with farming.
Got it.
But the Belgians, through their policies, even something as simple as introducing identity cards, really hardened these distinctions. They created this hierarchy where one didn't really exist before.
It's almost like they were manufacturing these divisions to set the stage for some sort of future conflict.
It's a great way to put it, and it had lasting consequences.
Yeah.
Because as the push for independence gained momentum in the 1950s, that resentment among the Hutu majority, it grew.
It seems inevitable in a way.
Absolutely.
Given the system that had been put in place.
Right.
So what happened?
Well, that resentment ultimately boiled over in what's known as the Hutu Revolution, this period of intense violence from 1959 to 1961.
Wow.
And it resulted in the overthrow of the Tutsi monarchy.
Okay.
And many Tutsis fled the country.
So they become refugees.
Exactly.
In neighboring nations.
Yeah.
So even though Rwanda gained its independence in 1962,
right,
this history, this violence, this displacement, it couldn't just be erased.
No, it left these deep scars on the nation.
It must have created this underlying tension.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's against this backdrop that we see the rise of the Rwandan Patriotic Front.
RPF.
The RPF right in the late 1980s.
And if I remember correctly, that was made up largely of exiled Tutsis.
Precisely.
Who wanted to come back to their homeland.
Yeah, they wanted to return.
Reclaim their rights.
Yeah, reclaim their rights. And their invasion in 1990 really ignited a civil war.
Okay.
And it further intensified those existing tensions within Rwanda.
And it was during this period, if I'm correct, that the Hutu government, led by President Habyarimana at the time, really started a systematic campaign of propaganda and fear-mongering against the Tutsi population.
Absolutely. And the documentary talks a lot about the role of media in this, particularly radio. They mention this station called RTLM that was very closely tied to the ruling party.
Wow.
And they used incredibly inflammatory rhetoric, even music, and constant reminders of past grievances to really demonize the Tutsi population.
It's an example of how the media can be weaponized.
It really is.
To incite hatred.
A chilling example.
And this wasn't just abstract propaganda. This had real-world consequences, as we'll see in Beata's story.
Yes.
Her experiences even before the genocide began are really eye-opening.
Even as a child, she witnessed this simmering tension and violence firsthand.
Wow. Starting
with the murder of her grandmother in 1987. Which she initially saw as an isolated incident.
But it was really a foreshadowing of the larger scale violence that was to come.
Exactly. And she even talks about how she was forced to declare her Tutsi identity at school.
Wow.
Which led to bullying fights. Just this constant reminder of the divisions that were so ingrained in Rwandan society.
It's terrifying to think about growing up in that environment as a child, just constantly aware of your identity as a potential target.
Absolutely. Yeah, and then the situation, escalated dramatically.
Oh, absolutely.
With the assassination of President Habyarimana.
In April of 94.
April of 94, that really became the catalyst.
For the genocide.
And there's still debate.
Right.
About who's responsible.
Exactly who was responsible for the assassination.
Right.
But the documentary makes it very clear that Hutu extremists immediately seized upon this as an opportunity.
And as Dr. Strauss describes it, roadblocks sprang up almost overnight.
Yeah.
Manned by Hutu militia.
Right.
And they began systematically targeting and killing Tutsis.
Yes, it's hard to imagine.
It's hard to imagine the fear.
And the level of fear and chaos.
They
must have gripped the country.
And the documentary highlights just how rapid the violence escalated.
Yeah, within days it went from these individual acts of violence to full-blown massacres.
Wow.
The government now, under the control of these hardliners, issued orders to eliminate the Tutsi population.
Wow, so this was planned.
This was planned. This was systematic experiment.
This was systematic. Yeah. And this is where Beata's story, I think, becomes even more powerful and heartbreaking, because she was in Kigali, the capital,
when the genocide began.
She describes the city just descending into absolute terror.
It's just unimaginable.
Imagine hearing the constant sounds of violence in the streets, seeing bodies piled up outside police stations.
Oh my gosh.
She even learned of her own mother's brutal murder during this time.
And this is what I find so disturbing about this genocide.
Yeah.
Is that it wasn't this, conflict between armies.
Right.
This was neighbor turning on neighbor.
Absolutely.
Often with these crude weapons like machetes.
Yes.
There was a very personal element.
A very personal element.
To the violence.
Beata even describes witnessing men being forced to dig their own graves.
Oh my gosh.
The psychological trauma of seeing things like that, especially as a teenager, is just hard to even fathom.
Yeah, and it's important to note that the documentary doesn't shy away from the fact that many ordinary Hutus were coerced or pressured into participating in the violence.
Dr. Strauss emphasizes this point. He talks about how people were told it was a matter of survival.
Right.
That if they didn't join in, they would be seen as enemies and targeted themselves.
So it was fear and manipulation that played a significant role.
Fear and manipulation played a huge role.
Not just, blind hatred.
It makes you think about the power of propaganda.
It does.
And how easily people can get swept up in this kind of mob mentality.
Absolutely. And as Dr. Strauss points out, this was a society where conformity and obedience to authority were deeply ingrained.
Right.
People were afraid to speak out.
Afraid to speak out, to challenge the narrative that was being pushed.
To go against the grain.
To go against the grain by the government, by these extremist groups.
Right. And they made these horrific choices.
They did.
Often out of a perceived need to protect themselves and their families.
Absolutely. But what about the international community?
Yeah, surely somebody must have seen this coming.
Right.
And tried to intervene.
Well, this is perhaps one of the most frustrating aspects of the Rwandan genocide.
Yeah.
The world's utter failure to act.
Really?
And the documentary examines several factors that contributed to this inaction, and it's a really difficult reality to confront.
For one, there was a UN peacekeeping force.
Yeah.
Already in Rwanda.
Right.
Before the genocide started.
Before it even began.
But as the documentary explains, their mandate was very limited.
They're very limited.
They were essentially observers.
Observers.
Not equipped or authorized to use force to stop the killing.
And as the violence escalated, the international community, especially Western nations, largely framed this conflict as tribalism.
Oh, wow.
They saw it as some age-old, incomprehensible hatred between these groups that outsiders couldn't possibly understand or resolve.
It's almost like they were using that as a way to distance themselves from the situation.
To abdicate any responsibility for intervening. Absolutely, and tragically, that reluctance was compounded by recent events in Somalia, where American soldiers had been killed during a humanitarian mission. And the documentary points out that this really created this climate of risk aversion in the West, making them hesitant to get involved in another conflict in Africa.
So in essence, the world turned a blind eye.
Yeah.
While hundreds of thousands of people were being slaughtered.
And Dr. Strauss makes a very compelling argument.
Yeah.
That this was a preventable genocide.
Wow.
He believes that decisive action by the international community, particularly in those early days, could have saved countless lives. Instead, the UN peacekeeping force was actually reduced in size.
It's heartbreaking.
It is.
To think about those missed opportunities. Yeah. The lives that could have been saved.
Absolutely.
If the world had just, recognized the urgency of the situation.
Recognized the urgency and acted decisively.
So what happened after the genocide? How did Rwanda even begin to heal from such a horrific event?
Well, the documentary explains that the Rwandan Patriotic Front, the Tutsi rebel group, ultimately defeated the Hutu government in July 1994.
Okay.
It effectively brought the genocide to an end, but of course the aftermath was incredibly complex.
Yeah, I can imagine.
You had a country completely shattered by violence with survivors and perpetrators now forced to live side by side.
Right.
And the question of justice was absolutely paramount.
So how did they deal with that?
Well, the documentary talks about how several layers of justice emerged.
Okay.
You had the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, which was established by the UN, to prosecute those high-level perpetrators, the ones who actually orchestrated the genocide.
The ones who planned it.
Exactly.
And oversaw it.
Yes. And while this tribunal was located far from Rwanda, it was crucial in holding some of those key figures accountable.
Okay.
But there was also this need for justice within Rwanda itself.
Right.
A way for communities to address the crimes that had taken place at a local level.
And that's where those Gakaka courts come in.
The Gakaka courts, exactly.
Which were community-based.
Community-based courts designed to create a platform for victims to share their stories.
Okay.
For perpetrators to confess and seek forgiveness, and ultimately for communities to begin that process of reconciliation.
It sounds like a very ambitious experiment.
It was a bold experiment, for sure. Yeah. It was a recognition that traditional court systems simply couldn't handle the sheer volume of cases that stemmed from the genocide.
So many people involved.
Exactly. But the documentary also makes it clear that the Gakaka courts were not without their flaws.
I can imagine that.
There were criticisms about potential biases, concerns about inadequate legal representation, and the fact that these courts could reopen old wounds in communities that were trying to heal.
And there's another crucial aspect to this that the documentary highlights.
What's that?
The Gakaka courts only address crimes committed by Hutus during the genocide.
Right.
There was no real mechanism for accountability for the crimes committed by the RPF, the Tutsi rebel group that came to power.
That's an important point, and it's something that Beata really struggles with in her story.
Yeah.
She shares her personal experience of actually confronting the man who killed her mother.
Wow.
This man served a short sentence and was then released back into the community.
It's hard to even process something like that.
It is, and her reflections on forgiveness in the documentary are so powerful.
What did she say?
She says, and I'm quoting her here, "I cannot feel forgiveness because what I feel is empty. Empty is the word. Because forgiveness for me, I feel like I'll betray my mother if I forgive the person who killed her."
It's such a raw and honest statement.
It really is.
It makes you realize that justice and reconciliation are these deeply personal journeys.
Absolutely.
There's no one-size-fits-all approach.
No, and the wounds of such a traumatic event can take generations to heal.
For sure. But even in the face of this immense pain, Beata's story is also one of incredible resilience. Despite everything she endured, she was able to rebuild her life in the UK.
Right.
Finding joy in her family and purpose in sharing her story.
That act of sharing, of bearing witness, is something she sees as crucial to preventing future atrocities.
And she emphasizes the power of words.
Yes. In the documentary, she argues that we all have a responsibility to choose our language carefully.
Okay.
Especially in times of heightened political rhetoric.
It's a powerful message, and I think it's incredibly relevant today.
Absolutely.
In our world where misinformation and hate speech can spread so rapidly online.
Beata's story is a stark reminder that the Rwandan genocide isn't just some distant historical event.
Right.
It's a warning about the fragility of peace, the dangers of unchecked hatred, and the devastating consequences of indifference.
Dr. Strauss brings up a question at the end of the documentary that I think is really worth reflecting on.
What's that?
He asks, what lessons have we learned from Rwanda? And if a similar situation were to unfold today, would we act differently?
That's a challenging question.
It is.
But it's one we need to grapple with.
Have we as a global community really learned from the mistakes of the past?
Right. Are we better equipped to recognize the warning signs of genocide?
Yeah.
And are we more willing to intervene to take decisive action to protect vulnerable populations?
I don't think there are easy answers to those questions.
No.
But I do believe that Beata's story offers us some guidance.
In what way?
She emphasizes the importance of listening to survivors.
Yes.
Of amplifying their voices.
Absolutely.
And of really understanding the long-lasting impact of trauma.
She also stresses the need for education.
Yeah.
For making sure that future generations are aware of what happened in Rwanda and the factors that contributed to this genocide.
Because ultimately, remembrance is a powerful tool for prevention.
Exactly. By keeping these stories alive, by learning from the past, we can hopefully work towards a future where such atrocities never happen again.
Well, this has been a truly profound deep dive.
It has.
Beata's story is one of incredible courage and resilience.
It really is.
And Dr. Strauss's insights provide, I think, much-needed context for understanding this very complex and tragic event.
It's a reminder that history isn't just about dates and events.
Right.
It's about people, about choices, and about the consequences of those choices.
And for me, it's a call to action.
Yeah.
To be more informed, more engaged, and more willing to stand up for what's right.
Because as Beata so powerfully reminds us, silence in the face of injustice is complicity.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
We encourage you to explore this topic further.
Yeah.
To seek out more stories from survivors.
Absolutely.
And to reflect on the lessons we can all learn from the Rwandan genocide.